We're going to look at 1 Chronicles chapter 4. 1 Chronicles chapter 4. And I'm going to begin reading with verse 6. And Naarah bare him Ahuzam, and Hepher, and Temani, and Haahashtarai, and other jawbreaker children. These were the sons of Naarah. And the sons of Helah were Zereth, and Jezohar, and Ethnan, and Koz begat Anub, and Zobeba, and the families of Aharhel, the son of Haram. And that's as good as I can do. In your mind, I'd like you to take a walk with me. We're going to go to the cemetery out back. Not the one behind us, the one in the corner, the one behind the upper room. Tilting headstones remind us of those who have come before us, who planted the spiritual seeds of what we know and enjoy as Salem Chapel today. By now, most of the survivors, I imagine, have died themselves. So visitors are few if there are any. Each stone marks an entire lifetime with just the facts: name, date of birth, date of death, perhaps a beloved something to somebody. If we look a little closer, we can learn a little bit more. Family names crisscross, so we can imagine a happy day when a man and a woman joined their lives together and became one. Next to those headstones, we find a marker with maybe just indicating a few days or a few months. And that tells us of crushing grief that they endured. Reading through the first 9 chapters of 1 Chronicles, to me, is a lot like walking through a cemetery. It's an endless genealogy of people who lived and died, with the names of people that we can't pronounce, and there's no context to give them any meaning to us whatsoever. To be honest with you, when I come across these genealogies, just to be honest, I find them boring. I really do. But when I come upon them, I do the best that I can to focus and to concentrate and to read through them. Because after all, they are also God's word. And they are no less inspired than the words in red that we attribute to Jesus in the New Testament of most translations. Yet in the midst of this monotony is a hidden treasure to be unearthed. And you'll find it where we left off in verses 9 and 10. And I think it's important for us to ask ourselves, what does God want us to see here? Verse 9. Jabez was more honorable than his brothers, and his mother called him Jabez, saying, because I bore him in pain. Jabez called upon the God of Israel, saying, oh, that you would bless me and enlarge my border, and that your hand might be with me, and that you would keep me from harm so that it may not bring me pain. And God granted what he asked. These 2 verses are all we know about this man named Jabez. But it's enough. It really is. God has a reason for singling him out and telling us about him. Now, I find 1st and 2nd Chronicles, sometimes for me, it's difficult for me to navigate and read through. But the purpose of these 2 books is to show God's elective and sustaining power. It tells us about how God chose Israel and how God chose David, and how he blessed them and sustained them through troubling times. These books were written during a time of great weakness and instability in the nation of Israel. The Jews had recently returned from 70 years of exile in Babylon. What they came back to was a devastated wasteland. People who were deeply impoverished, eking out a hardscrabble life. The city of Jerusalem was like a ghetto. There was no temple. There were no walls around the city, no gates. There was no protection whatsoever. And so these books were written because they needed to be reminded of the promises that God made to them in Deuteronomy 28. And they needed to rediscover their identity and know what it meant to be the people of God. As for Jabez himself, looking at the genealogy, scholars believe that he lived during the time, he was an adult during the time that Joshua led the Israelites over the Jordan River and conquered the land of Canaan. His name is a play on words in Hebrew that when translated into English means extreme anguish, intense sorrow, and great pain. Now, we don't know what that pain was. Maybe when he was born, they were poverty-stricken, and here was yet another mouth to feed. Maybe while mom was pregnant with him, dad had died. Maybe his parents were done raising children, and he was an unwanted and unwelcome surprise. Whatever that was, in any event, every mention of his name was a stinging reminder of the joyless circumstances regarding his birth. You imagine what that would be like? Little kid comes up to the door of the tent and says, "Hey, can Payne come out and play?" Or mom coming to the door of the tent and saying, "Hey, Payne, time for dinner." Payne. That's what you are to us. But how does God describe him? God said that Jabez was more honorable than his brothers. This man grew beyond the anguish and the sorrow of his birth, and despite his awful name, became such a great man in his time that God made a note of him. From an earnest prayer how did it happen? From an earnest prayer that God answered. And for what did he pray? Well, for 4 things. First of all, he prayed for divine ennoblement. Divine ennoblement. He asked for God's blessing. And this was not just a cliche. It wasn't just, bless me, Lord, as in help me out. If we could read the Hebrew this morning, I have to rely on others for that. We would find deep emotion here. He wanted an uncommon, he wanted an overwhelming blessing. He didn't want just a few breaks here and there to make life more comfortable. He wanted God to do something unique, something miraculous in his life. He wanted to break through the cloud that had covered his life. He wanted free from the sorrow that surrounded his birth and the limitations that had limited him up to this point. He wanted the past put behind him. He wanted a future that was good and blessed. This kind of blessing for which he asked, to the Hebrew, this was of extreme importance. It was a prayer that went beyond his individual circumstances. It went beyond the immediate situation of his life. This blessing for which he asked was tied to the covenant that God made with Abraham more than 500 years earlier. In essence, Jabez is asking God to take his life and to connect it with the divine plan that God has for Israel. He is asking God to make his life count and to have an eternal impact. He prayed for divine ennoblement. The second thing for which he prayed was for divine expansion. Now, this looks like raw ambition. It sounds like a health, wealth, name it, claim it prayer. Janis Joplin used to sarcastically sing, "Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes Benz?" If you take this prayer at face value, it could look like that, but it's not. Yes, in the ancient world, having more land, as Jabez asked for, having more land meant increased riches and increased power and honor. But it came with a sense of stewardship. By asking for more land, he was asking for an increased responsibility to God and an increased responsibility toward his community. He wasn't asking God to make him rich for his own sake and his own comfort. The promised land was part of God's covenant to Israel. And Jabez, through this prayer, was asking for a greater role in the plan of God. It's a prayer that he was embracing Deuteronomy chapter 28, that great chapter of blessings and cursings as Moses addressed his people shortly before his death. In that chapter, as the Jews are preparing to cross the Jordan and take possession of what God promised, the Lord through Moses told them that if they would keep him first, he would bless them, he would honor them, he would enrich them in every area of their lives, he would give them prosperity and success and make them the most powerful nation on earth. But if they forsook him, and if they chased after other gods, he would curse every aspect of their lives and take the land from them, which historically they did in 586 BC with the Babylonian captivity. It is possible if Jabez was alive during the Canaan conquest with Joshua, then he probably heard these words directly from Moses, what we read in Deuteronomy 28. So as Jabez asked God for an enlarged border, he is at the same time vowing to honor God with the totality of his life. It was an honorable and sanctified ambition that Jabez had. The third thing that I see here for which he prays is divine empowerment. He prayed, "Oh, that your hand might be with me." In Old Testament culture, the right hand was the symbol of power, strength, control, and skill. God's sovereignty and power are associated. You'll see this in the Old Testament from time to time, this phrase, the hand of the Lord. In asking for this, Jabez was making a prayer of reliance upon God and submission to him. You know, you can tell a lot about a person by how they handle failure. But I think you can tell even more about a person by how they handle success. Jabez does not want to feel any less the hand of God upon his life. He doesn't want success and prosperity to create any distance between him and God. Throughout the Bible, there is an established pattern. Those whom God blesses for the greatest and uses for the greatest impact are those who are in submission to his authority and seek to honor him above everything else. And then the last thing I see for which he prayed is divine enablement. And this last request is closely related to the one before it. God's hand is not only a guiding presence, it's also a protective power. It is very much tied to the promises that God makes in Deuteronomy 28. I also think it's reasonable to consider that Jabez isn't only asking God to guard him from future harm. He could also be asking God to unshackle him from his sorrow and anguish that characterized his life. I believe, based upon his name, He was asking God to free him from the ball and chain of his past. And God was pleased to answer this prayer with a yes. Now, I don't believe that God waved his hand and instantly gave Jabez riches and prosperity and a problem-free life, as if Jabez had suddenly won some kind of spiritual lottery. I do believe that it was over time, that as he lived his life, God prospered and guided and protected this man over the years. Now, I may be wrong in my thinking, and you may disagree with me on this, and that's okay if you do. But it has been my experience, as I encounter other Christians, that most of them really don't think too much of themselves. Rather, they think too little. And there is nothing wrong with filling a small space well. On the other hand, complacency is the dark side of contentment. God calls us to surrender our wills to him. And if you believe that your world is already as big as God has planned it, then by his grace and embrace it and fill it well. However, if you haven't taken the time to look to heaven and allow yourself to think beyond your present situation, what are you waiting for? What's keeping you from praying for an expanded vision and enlarged borders? What stops us from asking God if he might have a larger role for us to play in his divine plan? As we close this morning, there are 3 thoughts I want to leave with you. First of all, a struggling start and a difficult pass does not necessitate a limited life. God said yes to Jabez's prayer. Why wouldn't he say yes to yours? Second, no measure of success is safe without God's presence and power. We leave him behind to our own peril. And finally, when God blesses and prospers, there's no place for guilt. Never apologize for the blessings that God bestows upon you. Whatever it is that God has given you, use it for his purpose. Use it to honor him. Give of yourself generously to advance his kingdom and enjoy his goodness to the fullest. Have you asked God to give you a vision that goes beyond your current borders? If not, why not?